this Clinton Presidential Center Presents event. I am Jay Barth. I'm the director of the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum. And like all Clinton Presidential Center Presents events, our co-sponsors tonight are the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton School of Public Service, and the Clinton Presidential Library. Tonight's program, Lesser Known Stories of Early America, is also part of a week-long Teacher Professional Development Institute that we offer here at the Clinton Presidential Center the last week of June each year. This year and next, the Arkansas Civic Education Institute will focus on preparing teachers to make the most out of America 250, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, in their classrooms. And this summer, the Institute focuses on the first 125 years of constitutional creation and change, beginning with the key principles found in the Declaration of Independence. And this week we have right at 40 teachers of civics and history here, and they are with us this evening. So thank you all for being here. And thank you for all you do all the time in our classrooms at such an important time in the study of history and civics in this country and in this place. In addition to telling the better known stories of the documents and the great men who created these foundational documents, this institute attempts to balance that with the lesser known stories of those Americans who were crucial to shaping historical dynamics in this country. That's where this program tonight comes in. Dr. Catherine Adams is Associate Professor of History at the State University of New York's Geneseo campus. All right. Dr. Adams, who obtained her Ph.D. from the University of Illinois, has been a member of the SUNY Geneseo faculty since 2007. Professor Adams is an expert in the history of Black Americans in the early United States. Her research interests include early American history, African American history, women's history, and material culture. In 2010, Dr. Adams co-authored Love of Freedom, Black Women in Colonial and Revolutionary New England. Dr. Adams will be in conversation this evening about the story told through primary sources in that book and in her related research about the founding period. In conversation with Dr. Adams is our friend Quantia Fletcher, whom we all know as Key Fletcher. A native New Orleanian, Key makes it her mission to ensure that the beauty, value, and significance of the Arkansas African-American experience is curated and celebrated both far and wide. She currently serves as the director of Mosaic Templar's Cultural Center in Little Rock, after serving 8 years as its deputy director. And she actually joined MTCC prior to its opening in 2008 and has helped to develop MTCC into the only state-funded Black History Museum in Arkansas. Most recently, she has overseen a truly exciting overhaul of the museum's permanent exhibit. And if you have not visited Mosaic Templar's Cultural Center in recent months, go, go, go. It's an amazing exhibit that is now the permanent story there. Key's passion for preserving the Black experience spans over 20 years of service in history, cultural studies, and museum. And so please let us welcome Key and Catherine to the stage. Y'all can go on up. And thank you all both for being here. And Key, take it away.
Is the mic hot? Yes, it is.
Testing, testing.
Let me first say that it's my honor to be here tonight with you all. It's my honor to have this conversation with Dr. Adams. If you don't know me, one thing you will learn about me is I'm authentic and I'm very transparent. So I won't sit here and pretend like this is my area of expertise, because it ain't. My area is folk life and Southern culture. And so when I was asked to moderate, I was excited because it opened a door to a world that I hadn't thought about. As I began to thumb through the pages of the book and do my research, I really became enthralled with this idea of women who were much like the women of the stories that I've learned and been told here in the South, our sisters on the other side of the country. And so this work is groundbreaking, Dr. Adams. And I'm excited to have you with us tonight, and we're going to dig a little deeper into it. So again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you so much for setting the tone for this conversation tonight. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to get started.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So as a museum professional, again, it's my job to constantly share and tell Black stories. Those that have been untold. We're constantly uncovering and learning amazing truths about history and facts. And so the very first question I have to ask, especially for those who are not familiar with your work, is how did this all get started? What made you decide to write this book, Love of Freedom?
All right, so I started graduate school in the late 80s, early 90s. And as I was telling Key, that was around the time when there was a lot of reclamation of early Black history, African American history, and women's history. Oxford University Press published the series, the Schomburg series on Black women writers, right there around that time. And my local bookstore near my college had many of the volumes, and I was telling Key I was collecting them like Pokemon cards, trying to get as many of them as I possibly could. So I think in my collection now I have roughly 20 of those. I think there's like 32 or 36 of them, and I'm still trying to find the other ones. So as the title suggests, that was about reclaiming the work of 19th century Black women writers and activists, poems, people that told their own stories, short story writers, Pauline Hopkins, who did both newspaper work as well as short stories, folks like Charlotte Grimke, whose diary from the Civil War era was then published and then edited. But it also included, in fact, the oldest of the texts in the collection was the collected works of Phyllis Wheatley. Now, Phyllis Wheatley, of course, was familiar to a lot of people as an early, probably the most famous woman of the revolutionary period in the world in many cases, as folks have pointed out, because although she was born in what we think is Congo-Angola region in the 1750s, carried to New England, where she was purchased by John and Susanna Wheatley when she's maybe about 8 years old. By the time she was a teenager, she was publishing poetry in the local newspapers, writing elegies for folks, and then traveled to England, where she met with Selena Hastings, who was her sponsor and who helped her to get her volume of poetry published there in Great Britain just before the Revolution. So Phyllis Wheatley is this kind of global celebrity here in the Revolutionary period. So, as I said, so she was the earliest one in that collection. And as I studied in graduate school, I was increasingly interested in trying to understand the backstory of the experiences of women, Black women in the 19th century, the abolitionists, the writers, the activists, the doctors and teachers, and these folks whose lives were chronicled so well through the Schomburg collection. When I did my master's in American Studies at Michigan State University, and at that time, I was leaning toward literature, so I was deep in with Phyllis Wheatley and the other writers in the Schomburg collection. But it was also, what do they call, the postmodern turn was happening at that time. So I have a bad joke, and I always tell it, so you don't have to laugh, but you can. I thought that stuff was really confusing, so I took the postmodern turn as a suggestion and just turned down the hallway and went over to the history department. So, because that was the other area that I was interested in. And with American Studies, I did work with artifacts and museums and Black women's quilt traditions, in particular in Michigan. I actually got to pick up and then handle and deliver a Rosa Parks quilt that I was particularly proud to be able to be part of that story. Okay, so then I did my Ph.D. at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. When I started graduate school, I was interested in early America, but I was still sort of leaning into what was the very popular thing at the time, which was W.B. Du Bois. Everybody was writing about Du Bois. Everybody was doing intellectual history. And then I attended the Association of African American Life and History conference in Kansas City and sat around and had conversations with people like Deborah Gray White, Darlene Clark Hine, who was my advisor at Michigan State University. And one of the things they pointed out is that we needed more people who did early African American history. So I had a seed that was already planted some interest in that world, and now an encouragement to do so I could get a job when I graduated from graduate school. So I also had as my advisor Daniel Littlefield, who is a specialist in North Carolina slavery and rice production in particular. So that's where the story began. University of Illinois has one of the best research libraries in the country with this fabulous collection of stacks that you could get lost in all day long. So I was literally wandering the stacks. You crank the big thing to get into the space. They had the little bar there that you tap so you didn't get squashed in the middle of the night if someone else came and moved the stacks. And I came across a set of what were essentially the vital records for all these towns in New England. So if you know anything about genealogy, right, all these folks want to find their history on the Mayflower, right? So throughout, since the beginning of the history, I don't know what to say, they kept and collected a lot of these personal documents, marriage contracts or bans, right? Bills of sale, property, transmitting property, it's a very litigious culture as well, right? The Puritans and their Congregationalist followers were very litigious, so they kept really meticulous records of court cases and lawsuits and these sorts of things. So I just started flipping through. I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't know what I would find. And what I found were names of black people in New England as early as the 1640s, 1650s, 1660s, 1670s. Most of my courses were on slavery in the South, right? Because that was the area that most people studied when you talked about slavery was the South. Very little on the experience of black people in the North. So to me, that was really exciting. Not only could I find them, I could name them. And because there were so few of them, I would have ultimately a fairly representative sample, right? Because there's only a few thousand. And if I can name a couple of hundred, I'm doing something. Now, the naming part was also interesting. I was telling Key this story before. For the most part, at least through the 17th century and into the 18th century, most people who were enslaved, men and women, did not have surnames, right? Or whatever name they had originally was not typically attached to them. They had a first name. It may be one that was assigned to them by their owners, or maybe if they were first generation, it might have some sort of derivation of an African sort of sounding name. But they didn't have surnames. And for the most part, these collections of vital records were in alphabetical order by surnames. So I'm looking for them, and occasionally I see John Negro, Sebastian something or other, a name that sounds slightly African, maybe Angola is tossed on, so that sort of said, oh, that might be one, I might be able to follow that trail. Flipping through the volumes, and I discovered that there was a whole section called People Without Surnames. So then I started looking for those folks, where are they and who are they connected with? And then eventually I was able to see that this is Negro servant of, wife of Negro servant of, and I was able to start to build what eventually was a database that I created as a graduate student, trying to track them through many, many records. This project was similar, the woman who wrote Eat, Pray, Love. She's got this other book called Big Magic or something like that. And she talks about how sometimes an idea will take root in one place and maybe somebody will pick it up and then someone else picks it up somewhere else. So there was a little bit of this going on where folks were going around sort of collecting and creating these early databases. Now, we were still using Excel, right? So this is in the old days. We were on DOS, right? So this was very low technology at the time. But other folks started to build similar sorts of either databases or collections of names first and then following them through these records in these local archives, things found in folks' basements, in these vital records, court records, et cetera. So that's pretty much where it all got started. I think that it answers a lot of, yeah. So when I decided to make this my dissertation topic, I got the general sort of, Laura Ulrich talks about it with her project on Martha Ballard, Handmaid, or The Midwife's Tale, which some of you might be familiar with. She says, they told me you're not going to find much because women aren't there and they really don't do anything. And just like Laura Ulrich, who was actually one of my sort of heroes in this space, I said, well, I'm going to try it anyway. My father used to say this old saying, and I'm sure I'm not saying it right. He was from Georgia and he had all those folksisms, right? And his was, someone said it couldn't be done, and he with a chuckle reply. I don't remember the rest of it. There was another half of it, but that was sort of a mantra, right? That was in my mind. People were telling me, you can't do this. There's nothing there. The record is really sparse. And I said, well, I'm gonna try. So I named my dissertation, Who I Was is What I Did, because I didn't have a lot coming from their own mouths and their own experience. I didn't have the volumes of records that they had for the mass of the population that they had for for Southern history of slavery. I had a handful of scraps. And so I started building from those scraps. And I'm proud to say, when you say it's a foundational, groundbreaking work, even though it's 15 years since the publication, even though it's 25 years since I started my dissertation, I actually, on a regular basis, get people reach out to me about, thank you for opening this door, and other people have walked through it and done really exciting things with it. I'm super excited with where things have gone. But it has been part of this conversation about building big stories from small scraps. One of the ones that's most successful these days is the Ona Judge, right, who has become an institution, right? And that's another example. And actually, we did an early profile of Ona here. She'd already been discovered by Dunbar at that point, if you haven't read. Never Caught, You Should, right? Also a really wonderful history based on scraps, early Black women's experience. So that's where we started.
I have 1,000 questions in my
Sure.
head. I'm just going to ask a few. So you mentioned you started off with the search, looking at names, going, okay, this person probably has some type of African ancestry connection, and then you found a whole area that said people with no surnames. So the area that was people with no surnames, was that the jackpot? Were all of those people predominantly people of like African descent?
It turned out they were.
Okay.
Yeah, and like I said, part of it, I couldn't stop there, obviously. Then I had to find them in other places. And so I saw the pattern developing, right? And that, in fact, is what was happening. Now, as the years move on, as we move into the 18th century, then they start to have surnames as well, and you're able to find them. But then you'll also find their mother or their father or another family relation way back in those no surname lists as well. So what we started to see, or what I started to see it there in conversations with my undergraduate or my graduate school advisor as well, is that there were family stories that we could create across generations, which was something that was really exciting because it wasn't something that was being done as much in those bigger, more well-known histories of slavery in the South, which are these big sort of, particularly at the time, there are these sort of mega stories of big plantations and the economy of the South, and they're crop-based or region-based, right? So tobacco and cotton or sugar or Virginia or South Carolina or, Georgia, right? So this is one of the other things that was so different about this, is that I was finding people.
So as you're going through, how does the conversation, the narrative, what rises to the top of all the names become women? Like, what draws you particularly to that narrative, to that research?
Yeah, so like I said, one of the things that I wanted to understand is how we got to, by the early mid-19th century, Black women in community with one another, supporting the anti-slavery movement largely, right? But they're in New England, and they're school teachers, and they're activists. They are people who are born into families that have access to resources like wealth, like the Fortons and Putnams, and there's a collection of names of families in New England, Black families in New England, even from the time of the Revolution, who had a good bit of money, right? And their daughters went to school, they went to college, or they went to they became, again, teachers and activists. So I wanted to understand the roots of their world. What is it about Black women in New England that gets them ready by the mid-19th century to start these conversations? And this is one of the things, sometimes we say quiet as it's kept. Abolition did not start with William Lloyd Garrison, right? And Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And, and again, these white activists, I love me some Sarah Grimke. I could talk about her all day long. But they were inspired, encouraged, and really egged on by Black women writers and activists, right? So I wanted to understand them.
When I saw that, I was like a light bulb went off. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that oftentimes when you think about the Black narrative, it's very much a passive story. And when I saw that, I was like, how powerful is that? Mm-hmm. That we are the ones, the quote, we are the ones we've been waiting for, that we've always actively participated and had the idea. And another thing you talk about is Phyllis Wheatley and her being the first person in her work, the first African person to even mention this idea of freedom. Mm-hmm. When you said that, those two connections for me, like there was something in me that came alive. Yeah. Because the title of it, Who They Were What They Did, mm-hmm. is how we've been seen for so long. And I feel like even today we carry that residue as women and as Black women of feeling the need to be identified by what we do and not by who we are. And some of that we know is because in history and in research, it hasn't been there. Right. So how are you able to kind of piece together these narratives and tell the stories of these women from what they did?
Yeah, so, and that's what's behind the whole love of freedom. Like, what does freedom mean for them? Well, freedom means acquiring your own freedom and the freedom, liberty, right, of the members of your family if you can. But it also might mean improving the conditions within the situation that you're in, right? So that might, in fact, that did, particularly in New England, where they had very few, or access to very few people who would be their allies, who shared their race, their caste, their position. They needed white allies. They needed powerful white allies, right? They needed educated folks who were like lawyers, right? And maybe like physicians. They needed teachers. They needed people. They needed the pastors, the ministers of the churches that they eventually, again, why did they become Christian converts? For many of them, I'm sure it was sincere, but it was also a means to acquire some improvements, to ameliorate their conditions, either within slavery, and very often to advocate to get advocates and allies to support them in their desire to acquire their liberty and their freedom, right? So that is also, when we say who they were is what they did, these are people who were seeking freedom for themselves, right? Now that freedom was tenuous, right? And when I talk about, I say slave and free, I sometimes use the phrase marginally free and nominally free, right? Because even though they were maybe not, at some point, were able to acquire their personal liberty where they were no longer legally the servant, because they didn't really use the word slave of in the records. They tended to use Negro servant of. That was, again, a convention of the period. Even if they were able to shake that title, they had difficulty securing the things that protected and preserved liberty and freedom. That's land, right? That's education for themselves and their children. That's a business that can support their families in a place where racism and violence against, again, free, nominally free, marginally free Black people was also part of the situation. So what they did included suing people who tried to take their land, their family land from them, advocating for their children to get access to an education, especially their sons, again, because of the period that we're in. Like, as I said, associating themselves with people of power and influence within their communities in order to get them to help to support their attempt to acquire their freedom. So those are the things when I say what they did is who they were. So I was thinking when you were talking, I was remembering another sort of experience from my graduate school experience. One of my professors was a guy by the name of Robert Macaulay. And Dr. Macaulay was, generations respected scholar on Jeffersonian Virginia. That was his area. He was also really problematic, right? When I was in graduate school in particular, he used some pretty unfortunate terms and characterizations of Black people, Native Americans, and others, and women, very often in large lecture halls with hundreds of undergraduate students. So I was in graduate courses with Dr. Macaulay. He was also a very nice guy, I will add that, right? And at one point, we were having a conversation about where it is these, again, Black people, men and women, in the period around the Revolution, came up with the idea that freedom was something they might desire. So Dr. Macaulay his argument, and he could have just been poking the hornet's nest because maybe he sensed where I was going to head in my life, would say, well, they didn't know it until they read it, or until they heard about it with the Declaration of Independence. And I said, well, it seems to me that people know what freedom and not freedom is. And on some level, they must be feeling or articulating a desire for freedom. And that inspires them that, yes, they might have heard, oh, hey, it turns out America is saying we're going to be this place that advocates for freedom, that calls ourselves the land of liberty. We want a piece of that too. Now, they might have heard that and then act on that. And in fact, they did in the Revolutionary period all the way through the Civil War. But I'm going to shift to your other question here in a second. But that takes us back to the phrase itself, love of liberty, which we pull most strongly from, literally, out of the mouth of Phyllis Wheatley. So Phyllis Wheatley had communications with a Mohegan minister named Samson Occom. And she and Occom exchanged letters. She's a young adult, maybe 18, 19 at the time. And he's very interested in her spiritual education. And so he, at some point, poses a question to her in a letter that's no longer extant. Where it is, she comes up with this idea for freedom. We don't know the exact language. And this is her reply. In every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is, excuse me, pull my glasses up here. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us. God grant deliverance in his own way and time, and get him honor upon all those whose avarice impels them to countenance and help forward the calamities of their fellow creatures. This I desire not for their hurt, but to convince them of the strange absurdity of their conduct, whose words and actions are so diametrically opposite. How well the cry for liberty and the reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power over others agree. I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine. So, again, it's all there. She says, this is something that I have. This love of liberty is innate to us, right? She's couching it in the terms of the world that she lived in, which is, again, she is, as far as we know, born in West Central Africa, possibly to parents who were maybe practicing Muslims. There's apocryphal, or in her story, she talks about watching her mother, one of her few memories is watching her mother pour out water at dawn, right? And so scholars have said this might give us a sense of where Phyllis came from. In any case, she is sincere in her understanding, appreciation, and certainly use of Christian doctrine, identity, the culture, right, in the world that she lives in. And she's incorporated that here, that this same God that they worship, right, is one that she says has implanted in me this love of liberty. I did not need Thomas Jefferson to give it to me, right? So that was my response to Dr. McCauley.
Let the church say amen. There is this, as we're reading, there are 4 areas of freedom that you talk about, and you mentioned there are potentially others, but can you talk a little bit about those 4 areas in terms of how Black women are looking for and seeking freedom, and these are those major areas? How did you come up with those major areas? One of the ones you just talked about was religion, the others are family, and so how did you come up with and decide that these are the 4 that you were gonna, the pillars that you were gonna talk about in your book?
That's a really good question. I guess, ultimately, that was what the sources allowed us to see, right? We could see them, Lucy Terry Prince, right, in court with her husband Abijah, fighting to prevent their neighbor from stealing their pigs and taking their land, right? That's in the record, right? We can see married couples debating, or in a divorce, fighting for who has access to what resources and materials. And we see these women fighting back against a culture that women had very few rights. And so, again, property belonged to the men. A woman who was married under coverture lost her independence, her legal independence. It just didn't exist. Prior to that, it belonged to her father, and then later to her husband. So she acquired it only if she managed to make it to widowhood with something that needed to be preserved and protected. So what do we say? We say lands, we say the religion. Family was also there because we see these women, first of all, forming families, and when they're able to, fairly large families. So one of the stories that really touched my heart in the record were the Jacksons of roughly New London, Connecticut. So John and Joan Jackson, their story is actually really interesting. They are part of a religious community called the Rogerines, who were sort of kind of an offset, kind of wild Quakers, like really problematic Quaker Baptists. They would get in trouble with their neighbors all the time. They also apparently countenanced a lot of interracial, intimate interactions, which were not particularly popular. In fact, there's some suggestion that Joan herself was of mixed race. So Joan and John, at some point married. Joan is quite a bit younger than he is, and her original owner, if I remember the story correctly, because it's been a long time, I tried to review it, but I can see if I get it right, were owned by someone who had made some plans to emancipate her upon the death of one of the family members. It didn't happen because the son-in-law decided, no, Joan and her future progeny are mine. You know, that's one of the things when we talk about slavery in the North. First of all, it's there from the very beginning, right? Puritans, the people that we call Puritan, the Congregationalists, folks who we call the Puritans, settled in the 1620s and 1630s. Big Great Migration, 1640, right, is when we really talk about when that population really starts to expand. The earliest record of Africans in the colony, Africans as slaves, as well as indigenous American slaves as well, 1638, right? So it's right there in the beginning. And okay, so in any event, the Jackson family will do anything they can to maintain their freedom and independence. John and some members of the Rogers clan actually take a boat and try to kidnap Joan and one of her children at one point. And they do acquire them for a short period of time, and then the owner sues Samuel Beebe, who is another kind of common name in New England, if you know New England history, manages to recover them. John and Joan will go on to have, I think, somewhere like 5 or 6 children. Eventually they're able to acquire, to sue and get Joan's freedom and one of the children's freedom, but they spend essentially the rest of their lives in court trying to secure the freedom of their children, right? So that's what the record showed us, that they had families, they loved those families, they provided for those families, and they fought for those families. Lucy Terry Prince, Lucy Terry is probably recognized as the first Black American poet, right? Like Phyllis Wheatley, she's born in Africa, brought to the colonies, 1712, 1720, sometime in that neighborhood. She is in Deerfield, Massachusetts during the raids, the Narragansett raids on the colony, and she writes a very famous poem called Bar's Fight, where she describes the events. And it's humorous. We don't really have time to read it, but maybe we can later. In any event, later on in life, Lucy Terry and her husband, Abijah Prince, will, as I said, fight for their land, fight to get their children educated. So that is the other area when we talk about their search for liberty. So we have their...
You've got legal self-ownership, property ownership, professing faith, and securing freedom for their families.
Yes. Yeah.
I think one of the idea of like self-ownership. So the women who then became married, in a lot of instances, didn't have as many rights as single women, because again, this whole idea of freedom, initially as I'm thinking about it, most people think in terms of, oh, I'm free and I'm no longer enslaved. But there's all these different freedoms that women are fighting for, and hey, I may no longer be enslaved, but I no longer have freedom in terms of my own name, property, and all these other things that oftentimes I think we may not look at when we think about women in New England in the comparison to the women in the South. So as you're doing this research and as you're thinking back about it, the differences between New England and the South, what are some of the variances you find that are kind of different?
That's a really good question. Thank you. You know, one of the things certainly was true 25, 30 years ago. Maybe we're starting to change some of that now. I'm not conversed with all of the more recent, broader histories of women in the colonial revolutionary South. Most of, as I said, there was this period where there was just a lot of focus on women's history in colonial and revolutionary America. And it was people like Laura Ulrich, who I've mentioned, but also people like Carol Birkin, who did this sort of documentary history. There was Nancy Cott, Bonds of Womanhood, which is a history of like domestic, the women's spear, but pushing it back to the colonial period. So they were really working with those kinds of sources that talked about both the limitations, but also opportunities for women, and again, for white women, right? And there was more of that in New England than there was in the South. In the South, women were rarely educated. In the North, even in the colonial period, most women and most girls, that was part, particularly in Puritan New England, people needed to be able to interpret the Bible for themselves, right? That was part of their culture. So you would train your daughter how to read. You wouldn't really teach your daughters how to do math because that's business, although there were some who were being taught math and were doing math. In fact, there's famous things with Ben Franklin saying, this is one of the ways we're going to make America special, is if we start training our daughters in sums and figures. And then, because they might have a bad husband, like me, he would say, or my son, and we need to protect the property for the grandson, she'll be able to step in. And apparently his daughter-in-law was really an example for this. And in New York, right? The Dutch were educating girls and women all along. So that's one of the things that was different, is that there is this kind of history and culture of women having access to education and some rights, although they were still under the English common law with coverture and all that was there. So I think that there was just more of a conversation about the way that women's lives, free women, right? Non-bond women, let's say, lives that provided a way for us to see the possibilities for free, nominally free, marginally free black women, that there was less of that in the South. Now, particularly as we move into the 19th century, and there are a handful of people, Eliza Pinckney, right, in South Carolina, there's a handful of Southern white women who are running the plantation while father is ill or husband is in the war, particularly during the Revolution. There's a bit of that, but most of that conversation was happening in the sources in the North. And like I said, I don't spend a lot of time doing Southern women's history since graduate school, so there's other things, I'm sure, that have come out since then. But when this project was first underway, most of the work, interesting work on women in early America, was in New England.
So as we're talking about early America, and we know we're celebrating America 250, and we are specifically focusing on this time period, in my head, I keep thinking and I keep replaying, even as we as a state are thinking about or planning for the celebrations, planning for the remembrance. These stories.
Right. How do we get them in there?
How do we make sure that this is also American, that this is a story that we are telling and sharing and has relevance? How do we make sure that happens?
Wow, that's a good question. We're in a presidential library, right? So there is a tendency to focus on the people at the top of the food chain, right? And that has always been the case. In a way that makes sense, because that's where the most accessible sources are, right? But what we tend to forget is those folks have a world, right, that includes people who do not inhabit that rarefied space in leadership, right? They are exposed to people in their daily lives, right? The people who did their laundry, or who mended their clothing, or who, with our George Washington, the people that cooked the soft food because he was an old sick man,
Yep.
you know, by the time he's in Ona Judge's story, which is another reason why I say read Never Caught. It's totally fun. I teach it to my students, and we say, here is the George Washington you never got to meet. George Washington at home. He was a terrible person, very weak, and I mean physically weak, as well as like with Martha and George, it's a whole nother domestic story. But anyway, so people, there were people in the world around them that in order to understand who they are, to be honest and true to the historical record, we need to see who else is in their household. So it's important for us to know, well, I mean, turns out that Phyllis Wheatley wrote a poem to His Excellency George Washington and sent it to him. And by the way, he read it. And there is some belief that she visited him during the Revolution in the winter quarters, right? And they had a conversation. Now, there's a little seed that might be planted in George Washington's mind when he meets Phyllis Wheatley. Does he tell us right out that, yeah, you know, maybe this conversation that I had with this, not just with Phyllis Wheatley, but with Ona Judge and the other enslaved men and women in his household, who made him start to feel that little bit of ambivalence about slavery, right? So that when, as y'all know, when he dies, well, he sets in his will, he says, when Martha dies, then the people that are my property should be set at liberty. Which Martha was like, thanks, George. I guess I'm gonna set them all at liberty now, right? So you know, it's possible, and that's what I say. There are other people who are, in Hamilton, right? Who's in the room where it happened, right? So there are people who are around, and they're informing the way that they look at the world, even if they're like Thomas Jefferson and like to say things like, oh, you know, Phyllis Wheatley, she's basically imitative. It barely bothered, you know, why do we even bother to pay attention? You know, so he can go do whatever with Sally or whatever else he had going on. But again, these folks are around, and they're part of that world. When I started graduate school, we were reading this classic, which I try to teach on occasion, but people read differently today than they did when I was an undergrad for good and bad reasons. But I still love it. It was Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom. And if you do early American history, then you're of a certain age, and you're probably familiar with Morgan and American Slavery, American Freedom. But Morgan was made a very powerful statement when this was first published, and I think it was in the early 1970s. It's old. And he said, you can't understand American freedom without understanding American slavery, right? That the very thing that defines what slavery is not just for the revolutionary generation, but go all the way back to Bacon's Rebellion, right? And then you start to see the connection. We don't define freedom until we have something that is the opposite of freedom, right? So again, to me, that connects to this notion. We can't understand the people who are the ones that we celebrate, the people who are leading the charge, the vanguard for liberty, without understanding the environment, the conversation, the people, the unfree people who were around them, or the black women shopkeepers and bakers and washerwomen, right, who maybe were free or marginally free or nominally free, who they were interacting with.
I 1,000% agree. When I studied the antebellum South, when I worked with the National Park Service, one of the things I thought that was so fascinating and interesting was understanding the operations of daily life through understanding the enslaved people that built the communities and built the towns that people worked in. And I think it gave me a deeper appreciation for a history that wasn't taught to me growing up in school. And so I think that as we continue to think about how we celebrate America 250, that, you know, our teachers and our leaders and our presidential libraries and our museums, it's our job to make sure that we tell a very in-depth, full history that is representative of what makes us free, right? Are those who did the work to lay the foundation for our country.
Absolutely. So I was thinking about one of the questions that you sent me, and one of them is, you know, why do we need to know who these people are? And I sort of wrote out some of my thoughts. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I wrote, these are the main things for me, right? Because they existed, right? The historical record is incomplete unless we include them. And again, the thing about New England is it's not colonial South Carolina. It's not revolutionary Virginia, where you have a black majority, right? Or at least like a significant part of the population are black and enslaved people. It is a tiny minority. It's 4%. They're just there's maybe 1,000 of them, 4,000 of them, you know, it's by some numbers. There just aren't very many of them, and there actually are fewer of them as we get They're a smaller part of the population as we get closer to the revolution and emancipation for reasons that I'm still working through right now. But we need to know who they are. They existed. Our historical record is incomplete if we don't pull their stories out. Their struggles for freedom inspire us and show us what's possible. One of the things that struck me way back then and stays with me today is how important it is, as I said, to build alliances, right? And they needed to build a community of people around them. So that when Phyllis Wheatley, again, professes her fidelity to the Christian faith, yeah, it's possible that it's sincere. I can't know for sure, right? She certainly does speak the talk. But she's also aware that this is how she gets heard. So she wants you to hear her talk about, hey, you know that slavery thing? That's wrong. She says, hey, you know, like our modern Egyptians, right? Do I need to tell you the Exodus story? I'm gonna tell you your own story, and you're gonna, start to reckon with this thing that you're doing while you're trying to make this case that to Britain is enslaving you and all the rest of it. So, they needed to speak a certain language. So they inspire us to see what's possible for people who seem to have very few resources. There's also, as we just said, the impact that they have on others, including but not limited to those that we tend to celebrate when we discuss the Revolutionary era. And again, these really significant values and ideas about freedom and liberty and what they are. This was more than Woody Holton, who is one of the historians that I like a lot, that does the experience of women and black folks in the Revolutionary period. One of the things that he talks about is that it was more than a notion for them, right? Liberty is not just an idea for them. It's a very tangible thing for these people who are actual slaves, right? Rather than, we feel like Britain is enslaving us because they're making us pay taxes on tea. No, there's something very literal about the experience of people who are in bounds and whose children are sold without their permission or agreement or even some consideration for their feelings and what this would mean for them. All right, so their origin and survival story are our origins and survival stories. There is something to me on working, I teach, as I was mentioned, early American history, women's history. I teach a writing course that I did for the first time this year, and I'll actually be using one of the modules I created for that course in our conversation tomorrow. And it's on material culture, Taya Miles, All That She Carried. Fabulous, beautiful, beautiful, love it.
Can I come tomorrow?
Yeah, I love the book so much. But one of the things that our student population, we are a PWI, right? I'm lucky if I get 2 students of color in my classes. And in the context of this conversation that we're having right now about useful histories mean everything to me. So I had to start to think about, how do I make the history of these people that they have very little connection to, not just because of their race, their class, their status, but time. How do I make them care about them, right? Historical empathy is really important to me, right? So, and that's, again, another reason why I think that it's so critical that we tell these stories. We need to know who they are, how they felt, what they went through. It helps us, it helps our young people in particular to empathize with one another, with the challenges that people who live in the same world and same time they live in, who might look like them or might not, right, are facing. And that's really a critical, exercise in human development that I think we can do in a way that's maybe a little less painful because it's about the past, right? In that it doesn't feel like you're not personally responsible for what happened to them, but you are responsible for their erasure, right? And we as teachers are responsible for their reclamation, their restoration, right? So this is my activist project, right? That we are here to restore, rebuild, remember, as in member, right? To put bodies back into this historical record.
Ooh, that's so good. Round of applause.
I'm pretty proud of that. Yeah. It's good stuff.
I don't know. Sometimes I feel like the older I get, the more emotional I get. I'm crying all the time. But one of the things where you think about is, and one of the things you said, I'm thinking about, a lot of times traditionally in the South, there are these larger plantations, and not everybody had hundreds of enslaved people. That was not true. But there was maybe more of an opportunity to organize. Yes. And so you think about the names and the communities and the women and the people that you're talking about in New England. They don't necessarily have that sense of community. And so they have got to use the resources that they have around them to be able to make change and make things happen. So pushing the narrative forward and, and being active and engaging and using your voice looks different depending on the opportunity and the environment and the situation you're in. And that's something that I had not thought about in terms of, again, the juxtaposition of, women who are enslaved and free in New England versus in the South.
Yeah, and like, as you say, too, the difference between who I was as a undergraduate and then graduate student, discovering for me, again, I didn't invent these people. They were there, and there were people, we can go back to Lorenzo Green, 1942, the Negro in Colonial New England. There's work, that's being done early on where people are reclaiming these stories or at least putting them somewhere on the record. What I didn't see that I see now as a person who teaches courses on women's activism. I teach a course, Women in Social Movements in the U.S., and we highlight 4 periods or movements, anti-slavery movement and its associated rise in the early women's rights movement, the labor movement, other resistance movements prior to, and usually we use like the Triangle Factory Fire and labor activism, Jewish American immigrants in particular in the labor activism during the Triangle Factory Fire era. And it's the response to it, the civil rights movement, anti-lynching movement, Ida B. Wells, and then the civil rights movement and the modern women's lib movement. And one of the things that I point out to my students is that these folks are your age. Like, they are literally teenagers and young adults who are forming these little literary groups where they talk about, we need to do something about the age of consent law. In 1819, they're like, this is kind of problematic. Why is it okay for us to say that a 12-year-old girl can consent to having intimate relations? That needs to change, right? And then 10 years later, these same folks are arguing for Married Women's Property Acts in New York State, right? But I'm gonna get to the 1840s. And then they also start to be involved in the anti-slavery movement. So again, that's one of the things that I didn't see. I didn't know that world, and then as I've taught over the years, I just see that there is this arc, there is this line of activism that starts with young people, and it's really exciting to teach that to young people.
So let's talk about let's talk about what you're doing now, because this work is cherished and it's groundbreaking. You mentioned 25 years. What does your work look like now? What are you focusing on? What are you talking about? What keeps you up at night?
Woo, do we really want to go with what keeps me up at night right now? There is so much, but here's what I say to, I'm just going to throw this into the mix. So I'm a recent cancer survivor as well. And thank you. So there is a way that you get perspective, right, when you are a cancer survivor, but the way that there's like the trauma in the body, and there's all this, particularly Black women in academia, we have been dropping like flies in the last 10 years. I mean, if you're in that world and you hear the stories of folks are just stroking out in front of the class, like, because the pressures are so intense. So I feel fortunate as a historian in that I am exposed to the trauma, right? But I'm also exposed to the fact that people worked against it. And one of the things I think I mentioned to you, I have a course that I developed during COVID. Like I said, my teaching over the years has primarily been history of slavery, early America. So it's mostly folks who are enslaved, right? African Americans, at 99% of the population. I had reached a point where I needed a break from that. So I developed a course during COVID that I've called The History of Black Joy, right? So I went around looking for, because again, I'm a historian, I need primary sources, I need primary documents, and I didn't really find like a set of primary documents. I said, well, here's the thing. I'm gonna make the class, I'm gonna get me a Bedford contract, we're gonna have a website, we're gonna start to pull on the strands of Black joy in history. So that is one of the projects that I'm involved in. I've taught it once, then I stepped into administration, which was a terrible mistake and nearly cost me my life and probably facilitated my cancer diagnosis. There's a whole nother set of stories there. Higher ed is a mess right now, good gracious. So I'll be teaching it again this fall. So in the History of Black Joy, we talk about, okay, again, I'm a historian. I know the historical record. So we're going to do slavery, but we're also going to talk about the cakewalk, right? We're going to talk about, and its roots, and then how it eventually becomes TAP, and then it becomes Broadway. And then Savion Glover opens up Broadway at the end of COVID, right? just feelings flowing all over the place, joy, food. We're going to talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but we're going to talk about Hercules, a Washington chef. We're going to talk about the Jefferson, enslaved man in Jefferson's household, can't remember his name right now, who essentially is credited with inventing macaroni and cheese, right? So we're going to talk about, eventually we're going to get to Beyonce and to what's the child, the gymnast, and Simone Biles and Misty Copeland, and we get to all of those folks. We have a huge unit. I wanted to do something on Joe Louis because I'm from Detroit. So I said, well, I know enough about this history because we used to see that giant, ridiculous fist statue right downtown in Detroit, which people loved. I mean, it's so aggressive and it's also really ugly, but it's clearly an expression of like joy in something in this story. So I started doing some work. Turns out Captain America, that's Joe Louis. And during World War II, this is what I'm saying, during World War II, they were using they hired Joe Louis to do these kinds of events around the country, so he symbolized this whole notion, and they put him in the uniform. There he is, right? So it's lovely. I got a unit on Joe Louis, Captain America, all the way. I go from Haile Selassie to Wakanda, right? And in there I have Joe Louis as Captain America, and it's fabulous and wonderful stuff. So that's one of my projects. I was telling this young lady here I was sitting next to here that one of the other projects I have that I've been slow rolling but working on for many years, because I am a little bit obsessed with Phyllis Wheatley. Like, I carry her around in my mind and heart all the time. I'm a scrapbooker. I'm a creative person. I do a lot of collage. I have way too many craft supplies. But, you got to put your money somewhere. I'm not a jewelry person. I'm a stamps, stickers, and paint person. And so I started working on a visual reconstruction of Phyllis Wheatley's world, not just the physical world that she lived in, but the references. Like, how is this girl, this 15-year-old, writing about the muses and the Parthenon? And, like, she's got to be seeing. She's got to be seeing some of these pictures and sculptures, and people must be describing these things. So I want to, find those in the contemporary, images and illustrations that she may have either had described to her, that she may have seen in a book, and line them next to the poems. So it's a virtual, scrapbook of reconstruction of Phyllis Wheatley's world. So and that's a joy project for me. So
You have to come back. You have to come back. Like, it makes my heart sing, because I understand the work that you do, because it's very closely related to what I do. And those experiences of joy, we need the balance. We have to have both. So I'm very excited about that. I love Phyllis Wheatley as well. Is it down the road?
Oh, yeah, we're running out of time. Oh, yeah, 6:58.
Oh, no.
Sorry, I know you guys are exhausted. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for spending this evening with us. Thank you, everybody.
All right, good evening. I hate to be the one to cut this conversation, but I am delighted to be the one that will have Dr. Adams back here tomorrow working with our teachers at the Arkansas Civic Education Institute. So we're going to continue this conversation, and we're going to be talking about her research. I want to thank Dr. Adams. I want to thank Keith Fletcher. Thank you so much for being here. Fabulous moderator. And I should introduce myself. I'm Kathleen Pate, Director of Education and Public Programs here. And I want to extend a broader invitation to you all. This is kind of the soft opening, the soft kickoff for our commemoration of America 250. Right, so next July 4th, 2026, marks the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And as we move through this year, we're going to continue to explore those lesser known, lesser told stories. And if you don't have plans on Wednesday night, well, if you do have plans, you should cancel them. And join me and my teacher friends who are here today. At the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts, we're partnering with them. We have Aston Gonzalez, Dr. Aston Gonzalez, who wrote a book called Visualizing Equality. and it's about art and the abolitionist movement. And so that's going to be at 6 o'clock at AMFA on Wednesday, the 25th. And then make sure you're signed up for the Clinton Presidential Center newsletter, because that is how you find out about these great events that we're having. And I really appreciate everyone coming out tonight. Thank you again.